Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to the final talk in the Thoresby Society's November lecture series for 2025. I'm Antony Ramm, the Senior Librarian for Collections and Heritage at Leeds Libraries, and I will be speaking in this lecture about one of the genuine treasures held at our Central Library, William Boyne's 7-volume Grangerized History of Leeds. First, however, I just want to say a few words about how this talk came about in the first place. As you may or may not know, this talk has emerged from an article published in the latest edition of the Thoresby Society's publications, a special edition dedicated to the legacy of Ralph Thoresby on the 300th anniversary of his death in 1725. I was invited to contribute a piece about William Boyne and his history of Leeds as part of thinking around Thoresby's legacy as a historian specifically. My article is titled Arranging and Disarranging Books, William Boyne's History of Leeds. There's an awful lot of overlap between the talk and the article, but there's certainly also material I've had to leave out of the talk. So I would definitely recommend you read the article in its entirety if there's something that I don't cover in this talk. Otherwise, I can be contacted through the email address, which was on the first slide and which will be seen again on the final slide of the lecture. That said, and before getting into William Boyne himself, I'd just like to start with recapping some of what many of you will probably already know about Ralph Thoresby himself. Thoresby is known today as the father of Leeds history, largely because of his book, the Ducatus Leodiensis, which was published in 1715 and was the first written history of Leeds. That said, the book isn't really a history book at all, at least not in the way modern readers would usually understand that term today. A chronological narrative of what happened when. Instead, the Ducatus was in the 17th and 18th century tradition of a chorographical survey, a genre which has been described as comprising an eclectic mix of geography, history, genealogy, heraldry, archaeology, etymology, coupled with contemporary observations of the author. What that means for our purpose today is that Thoresby's book largely follows a geographical rather than chronological structure, starting in Leeds town centre as it was in the early 18th century, and then branching out to cover other areas in the old Leeds boundaries. And at each point, Thoresby gives geographical, historical, genealogical, heraldic, archaeological, and etymological details, plus his own thoughts about each place. In doing so, in collecting such a vast range of materials in one place, I think it's fair to say that Thoresby has inspired or influenced almost all historians of Leeds down to the present day, albeit often in subtly different ways. Some have used Thoresby as a source, someone to reference in support of their own claims, while others have, in my view anyway, walked very much in the paths laid down by Thoresby in the Ducatus in terms of the types of material considered suitable for inclusion in the story of Leeds' past. And then there is a third category, those historians who have built on the platform Thoresby provided, in that they have directly adapted or updated his core work, the Ducatus Leodiensis. Two such historians who followed within a century of Thoresby's death were two Thomases, Thomas Wilson and Thomas Dunham Whitaker. Thomas Wilson was an 18th century Leeds schoolmaster and extremely prolific antiquarian who collected, transcribed, and identified such a large selection of very valuable and important material about the town that, if Thoresby is the father of Leeds history, Wilson is undoubtedly the unsung hero of Leeds history. I am absolutely very far from an expert on Wilson. My colleague Philip Wilde is, however, and he has written an excellent article drawing attention to Wilson's life and achievements. In the same Thoresby article, you can find my Boyne article. Very much urge you to read Phil's article, but for now it's sufficient to note that one of Wilson's most important efforts was his annotation of Thoresby's Ducatus. In those annotations, Wilson updated and occasionally corrected Thoresby's original text down to Wilson's own time in the mid-1740s, and you can see an example of those annotations in the image on the right of the slide. Those annotations were, early in the next century, used, not always with an accurate credit, it must be said, by another Thomas Dunham Whitaker. Whitaker was a clergyman whose connections to Leeds were rooted, at least in part, in his marriage into a distant branch of the Thoresby family. At any rate, whatever his motivations were, Whitaker edited a second edition of Thoresby's Ducatus, published almost exactly 100 years after the first edition, and incorporating Wilson's annotations as footnotes. Whitaker, however, did not stop there, publishing also in 1816 a book called Lloydis and Elmet, which acts effectively as a sequel to the Descartes, bringing the story down to the early 19th century and also expanding its geographical focus to roughly the area some 10 miles out from Leeds. Whitaker's book, like Thoresby's, also follows the chorographical tradition of geographical, historical, genealogical, heraldic, archaeological, and etymological details, taking each area in turn, starting with Leeds before venturing out around the wider West Riding. This is effectively where William Boyne comes in with his history of Leeds, but before we get to that, some biographical background about the man himself. William was born in Leeds around 1814 to Thomas and Mary Boyne. Thomas, his father, was a successful local businessman, and William inherited his father's financial interest on Thomas's death in 1849. This made William rather wealthy by all accounts, albeit the money made him no more interested in commercial affairs than he had been previously. Instead, William's main interests were antiquarian, primarily numismatics, the study of old coins, but also more broadly the history of his native Leeds and Yorkshire. Boyne used his new wealth to build a vast library of material about Leeds and Yorkshire. He also hosted weekly antiquarian symposiums at his Queen Square home with such like-minded friends and colleagues as James Wardell, John Dixon, and William Bowman. These gatherings were particularly beneficial for William in the years after the sad passing of his wife Anne. The two had only been married for 2 years at the time of her death in 1844. Boyne soon moved away from Queen's Square, his house later becoming the home of the Thoresby Society, in fact, and had built for him a unique home in Headingley known as the Woodlands. He didn't stay there for long, however, leaving Leeds entirely in 1858. It was said that he had developed an unconquerable prejudice against the town, and he moved first to London, then to South Africa, France, and Italy, dying in Florence in 1893. In his lifetime, though, Boyne used his vast library of antiquarian material to research, write, and publish books, including his Yorkshire Library, the guide to published works on the county. Many of the items in its pages could be found in his personal library and archive. But by far the most important use Boyne found for his wealth and his library of materials was his history of Leeds. In its simplest terms, this history is Thoresby's Ducatus, via Whitaker's second edition, plus Whitaker's own Lloydis and Elmet, expanded out from 2 volumes to 7 volumes. And these aren't small volumes either. Hopefully this image on the right of all 7 large folio volumes gives you some idea of their size, plus this image of Volume 1 open at its title page. Please get in touch with us here at the Central Library if you'd like to see the Boyne in person. Access is by appointment only, but we're always very welcome to, happy to welcome people to see the Boyne in person. It's a real delight to see. The full history has been held at the Central Library by Leeds Public Libraries since its purchase in 1898, and has been hailed by librarian J. Alexander Symington as a masterpiece of antiquarian workmanship and the most fitting monument the city can boast of to the memory of so illustrious a citizen. So how did Boyne expand the 2 original volumes of Thoresby and Whitaker's works out to 7 very large volumes? Well, he achieved this through a process very popular in the 18th and 19th centuries and known as Grangerizing or extra illustration. The principle behind extra illustration, in short, is, as the name suggests, to illustrate the text of a book with images extra or additional to its original contents. Images pulled from a wide range of other sources, including other books, commercially available prints, commissioned works, and historical ephemera, all inserted between the pages of the base work at points appropriate to its text. On the screen here is an example of that process. This is a print showing Bradford Church, photographed from an edition of Edward Parsons' History of Leeds, Grangerized by the Bradford antiquarian James Norton Dickens, and also held by Leeds Central Library. Helpfully, Dickens has added a note underneath explaining where he got this particular print from. He says that it was extracted from a work, The Memoirs of General Fairfax, written by himself and published in Leeds in 1776. So that, in short, is how Boyne expanded the 2 volumes of the Descartes and the Whitaker out to 7 volumes. by inserting additional extra illustrations between their pages. In doing so, of his 7 volumes, the first 3 contain the contents of the Ducatus, and volumes 4 to 7 those of Lloydus and Elmet. So that was how Boyne created his history of Leeds. But why is it now considered to be, in Symington's words, a masterpiece of antiquarian workmanship? In short, it is the sheer quality and quantity, it must be said too, of his editions. A selection of those can be seen on the screen here. From top left, going clockwise, a print showing the interior of St. John's Church in Leeds by Thomas Sutcliffe, a watercolour by W.R. Robinson and showing the Temple Mill complex in Holbeck, another watercolour, this time by John N. Rhodes and showing the Harewood Arms Inn in Leeds. Finally, an extract from an original and therefore very, very valuable letter received by Ralph Thoresby from one of his children. I'm not dwelling on these particular images in this talk today because each can be seen in their entirety in my article, along with some additional information about their contents or the biographies of the artists where those are known. Instead, what I want to do in this lecture is show you some of the material that I mention in the article, but which, owing to restrictions of space, I was unable to include images of. I'm going to largely stick to the structure that I followed in the article in terms of grouping together material in the 4 major categories across Boyne's history of Leeds: maps, plans and prospects, prints and portraits, watercolours and other artistic works, and finally, historical ephemera and miscellaneous items. That said, I must stress this really is just scratching the surface of the full 7 volumes. While searching for copies of images to show in this lecture, I ended up grabbing many, many more with a view to adding many more images into the slideshow. There's literally something worth seeing in almost every one of Boyne's volumes, and I could have expanded this slideshow out easily to another 50 slides or more. As the article explains, however, we do have here at the Central Library a full index to his editions, which is helpfully digitized and easily accessible by researchers. And again, just get in touch with us if you want to see that index as an example of that printed index on the page on the screen now. So all that aside, our first category, maps, plans and prospects. That said, the first image that you can see here is not taken from Boyne's editions at all. I'm sure, in fact, many of you recognise this as Francis Place's 1715 prospect of Leeds from the Nostrop Road, a view across Leeds that can be seen in Thoresby's original Ducatus Leodiensis. And I'm showing you this today really only so that I can show you this, which is Place's original sketch for that prospect, which can be seen in Volume 1 of Boyne's history. Also no doubt familiar to many of you is Samuel Buck's Prospect of Leeds from the South East. Boyne included a wonderful copy of this 1745 view in Volume 1 of his History of Leeds, a print that is so large it has to be kind of folded out when you open the book. And in fact, as you can see here, a photograph of it is slightly too big even for the slideshow. Another image that many of you will be familiar with, Another image that many of you will be familiar with, a copy of Christopher Saxon's map of Yorkshire and reproduced from his very rare and very valuable late 16th century Saxon atlas. There's a print of the Yorkshire page from that atlas in Volume 1 of Boyne's History of Leeds. But now we get into views that may be less familiar to some of you at least. Seen here in Volume 1 of the history are these 2 views of Gawthorpe Hall by William van der Hagen and dated to 1722, that's one on the screen now, and 1727 respectively. Similar is Johannes Kip's rather wonderful bird's eye view of Temple Newsam, that's in Volume 2. On to Volume 4 now, and this very well preserved copy of a plan of the Grand Canal between Leeds and Liverpool. Volume 5 contains several maps. Many of these will be very familiar to anyone who has studied Leeds past, including Giles' Plan of Leeds from 1815 on the screen now, Fowler's of 1831, Baines and Newsam's of 1839, and William White's of 1845. Much less familiar, to me at least, however, was this map, John Heaton's Plan of Leeds from 1812. As far as I can tell, this is the only real copy we have of this map in the Central Library collections. All others appear to be copies of this original, so this is one that I hadn't seen until I started researching Boyne's History of Leeds. There is, in fact, a very useful article by John Rawlinson Thorpe about this very map, published by the Thoresby Society in 1904, if it's equally unfamiliar to you and you wish to know more. Boyne also includes maps showing other areas of the West Riding, a way of visualising Whitaker's expanded focus on areas outside Leeds, including, as you can see here, an Ordnance Survey map showing the area around Wakefield at 1 inch to 1 mile scale. Speaking of Wakefield, here is a wonderful view of Wakefield from its bridge, one of several prints and prospects showing that city. This one's from volume 7. Wakefield, in fact, is particularly well represented in terms of Boyne's additions to his history of Leeds, no doubt a reflection of Wakefield's historical importance. Other views include this print showing Samuel Buck's south prospect of the ruins of Sandal Castle, which sits nicely alongside this similar print of the same location. While here we have this excellent view across Bradford, and there are similar views like this in other volumes of the history. This one's in volume 7, showing places like Huddersfield and Halifax. We move on now to our next category, prints and engravings inserted by Boyne, kicking things off with this very impressive southeast perspective view of the Mixed Cloth Hall at Leeds. This is another like Buck's southeast prospect that we saw a few slides ago that requires unfolding to see its full extent. So far, we've mainly seen images of buildings and landscapes, but Boyne was equally prolific inserting portraits of individuals mentioned in Thoresby and Whitaker's texts, including, as you can see here on the left, John Harrison, and on the right, Thomas Lord Fairfax. And these two stand here for many, many more portraits of individuals across the whole 7 volumes of the Boyne, probably numbering in the hundreds easily. Similarly frequent throughout the 7 volumes are images of religious buildings. Kirksall Abbey alone is seen in over 15 prints, including this one, and the 2 on the left here, the bottom image being the most interesting, I think, in that it shows a floor plan of the abbey. Similarly interesting are the 2 images on the right, showing the old and new Mill Hill Chapel buildings in Leeds. To the best of my knowledge, these images, or at least images like them, cannot currently be seen on the Leodis Image Archive run by us at Leeds Libraries, making them a particularly unique addition to the historical archive of the city. Secular buildings, of course, are not neglected, and we've already seen a couple. Here's another one that I mentioned in the article itself. This print showing the Cloth Hall and Courthouse at the corner of Infirmary Street and Park Row. Alongside this print, Boyne also gives us this smaller view of the interior of the Mixed Cloth Hall. That one is one that I really like. Prints of other secular buildings include the Central Market, the commercial buildings at the corner of Boar Lane and Park Row, the Leeds Stock Exchange building I think that was on Albion Street. And then among many, many other prints showing the Town Hall in Leeds is this brilliant sketch of the interior of the Victoria Hall on the occasion of a banquet to George Beecroft in honour of his second return as MP for the Borough of Leeds. That last print showed a scene in 1859, and travelling rapidly back almost exactly a century to 1749, I particularly liked this print, imagining a scene showing the Reverend George Whitfield preaching at Leeds. Not entirely dissimilar is this image in that it shows another view lost to history. This print showing the Baptist Chapel on South Parade in Leeds city centre. Once again, to the best of my knowledge, there are no other images of this chapel on Leodis at present, so I'm very happy to be proven wrong if somebody can find one on there, of course, but if that is the case, it points to one of the key values of Boyne's history, is bringing together in one place images of buildings and landscapes that have long since disappeared across Leeds and the wider West Riding. Speaking of which, once again, areas around and outside Leeds are not neglected. Seen here is a print showing, I think that's showing St. Peter's and St. Leonard's Church in Horbury. Back to Wakefield now, and this is another one that I really liked. And it shows the interior of the famous Chantry of St. Mary on Wakefield Bridge. And there are also prints showing many secular buildings around the West Riding, such as this one showing the West Riding of Yorkshire Proprietary School, which is also in Wakefield, and that one can be seen in volume 7 of Boyne's history. We come now to possibly our most impressive category, original watercolours and other works of art added by Boyne to his history. You can see around the slide some of the images included within the article itself. I won't go into detail about these now, as we're going to look at some other examples from each of these artists now, but these are going clockwise to the top left. Joseph N. Rhodes, Joseph Rhodes, John Dixon, and W.R. Robinson, and these four are the artists featured most often by Boyne throughout their history. For reasons of time, I'll also have to skip over any biographical details about these artists. These are included in the article itself, where known. And I've also had to restrict myself to just 3 images or slides per artist, as there are just so many more of their images included across the history's 7 volumes. I'll start with this watercolour by the Leeds artist Joseph Rhodes. This shows the old Leeds parish church before its demolition in the late 1830s. While this slide shows his painting of the old grammar school building in Leeds town centre prior to the school's move to Woodhouse Moor. And here, Rhodes's watercolour of an old house at Alton, said to be the birthplace of the 17th and 18th century scholar Richard Bentley, plus sticking with birthplaces of important people around the West Riding, Boyne also included Joseph Rhodes' sketch of the birthplace of Joseph Priestley in volumes. Those last two are both in volume 6 of the history. Now to the works of John Rhodes, Joseph's son. John is well known for his watercolours showing the interior of the old parish church prior to, and indeed during demolition, as well as his view of the old shambles on Briggate. But other works by John that are well worth drawing attention to, however, include this watercolour showing the Aaron Calder Company warehouse on Warehouse Hill and his distant view of Armley House from Giants Hill. Plus, among other images of areas around or outside Leeds, this sketch of what is said to be Robin Hood's grave at Kirklees Park. Our next artist, who is one of the most frequently seen throughout the history and in fact was a friend and correspondent of Boyne himself, is John Dixon. Boyne has inserted many of Dixon's sketches, including this one of the Red Hall in Leeds town centre. Often Dixon's sketches are of churches and chapels and are included by Boyne to fill the empty space at the bottom of a page, including, as you can see here on this slide, examples such as sketches of churches at Beeston and Harewood. Dixon, as with most of the artists Boyne features, does not restrict himself to Leeds. On this slide, you can see sketches of the church and tomb at Saxton on the left and Castleford Church on the right, both an exterior and an interior sketch. We now come to the last of the 4 main artists featured by Boyne, W.R. Robinson. Robinson was by far one of the hardest to narrow down to 3 images, as he's extremely prolific across the history. Robinson was another, though, who seemed equally interested in secular as he was in religious buildings, capturing a pretty fair balance between the two in his work, including, as you can see here, the old Black Horse Inn at Mabgate. As an example of the religious buildings Robinson painted, you can see on this slide St. Matthew's Church in Holbeck. Robinson again was no similar to the other artists we've seen. Robinson again was no stranger to painting areas outside or around Leeds, capturing lost buildings in the process, including halls in both Killingbeck and Methley. Joseph and John Rhodes, John Dixon and W.R. Robinson are the 4 main artists featured throughout the history, but there are others, of course. Some of their works can be seen here. Going clockwise from the top left, you can see Kiddle Hall by William Boyne, Rothwell Holy Trinity Church by T.H. Briggs, Ledston Hall by J.C. Buckler, and Ingram Hall by J. Martin. And there are 2 other artists I touch on in the article and whose work is among the most significant across the whole history. Those are William Lodge and Henrietta Dowes. This was some regret, but there didn't seem to be any way of including them in this talk without simply replicating exactly what I've written in the article. So I've left them out of this lecture, but consider that your incentive to read the article if you've not already done so. Both artists' work is really impressive and really worth finding out a little bit more about if you can. But our final category of material added by Boyne across the 7 volumes of the history is historical ephemera and miscellaneous items. These include the two you can see on the screen here, original letters to both Thoresby on the left-hand side and Whitaker on the right-hand side. Thoresby's is a letter from his correspondent Matthew Smith, while that to Whitaker is from the artist Frederick Nash and concerns plates that Whitaker had commissioned for Lloydis and Elmet. Neither of these letters, as far as I can tell once again, are reproduced in any collection of correspondence to either Thoresby or Whitaker, making them historically very significant. In terms of other ephemera, once again, there's far more than I can cover in this lecture today, so I just wanted to highlight one or two things. Starting with a small handful of photographs that Boyne included across the history, such as the one here of the Leeds and Yorkshire Assurance Company building on Albion Street, which is supplemented with a news cutting and print showing and describing the same building. Boyne includes other newspaper cuttings, in fact, such as the one on the left here, which is a report and statistics concerning the 1851 census for Leeds Borough. Very interestingly, and this is something we'll come back to in a few minutes, Boyne himself has added in the bottom left-hand corner of the news cutting pencil notes updating the population statistics down to 1892, just a year before he died. And then on the right can be seen the front page for an 18th century edition of the Leeds Mercury. Boyne actually pastes into the history the entire edition of that day's paper, along with doing the same for an 18th century edition of the Leeds Intelligencer. Finally, however, are two of my favourite pieces of historical ephemera across the 7 volumes of Boyne's history, even if I don't entirely know what it is I'm looking at in both cases. The image on the left shows an ecclesiastical calendar for the St Saviour's Church, while the image on the right shows a printed portrait of Robert Ferrer, Bishop of St David's in Wales, and formerly the Prior of Nostell Priory. Both these items appeal to me largely because of their colouring. Many of the images in Boyne's history are black and white or sepia kind of sketches or prints, so it was nice to kind of see some colour while looking at these two pieces of ephemera. But also, in the case of the calendar on the left-hand side, its sheer size, this is another one that has to be kind of folded out when you're looking at it. The Ferrer portrait almost sort of looks like a playing card. I kind of imagine that is really not what it is at all. Anyone who's got any ideas about what it is, do please get in touch. Regardless, either way, whatever it is, whatever its purpose was, it's simply just very pleasant to look at. I really like the colour and the design of the kind of border around the outside, at least in my view. So hopefully that overview of the 7 volumes of the history has given you a sense of why Symington called it a masterpiece of antiquarian workmanship. More specifically, in my view, there are 3 main reasons why that description can be applied to Boyne's work. Firstly, Boyne has preserved historically important material for future generations, lots of it, and much of it, as we've seen, of a very, very high quality. The material doesn't just cover Leeds, of course. We've also seen many examples of important materials covering other areas in the Old West Riding. These include many images of buildings, views, and landscapes since lost to history. That said, some of this material is now available digitally, whether that's through a platform such as Leodis or through other digital copies of some of the commercially produced prints that Boyne includes in his history. Either way, regardless, there is still a very clear, a very real benefit in Boyne bringing all those materials together in one place. Not least because in doing so, in bringing all this material together specifically to illustrate the Ducatus Leodiensis and Lloydis and Elmet, Boyne has without question enhanced our experience of reading Thoresby and Whitaker's texts which could be, for the modern reader, inaccessible and occasionally even impenetrable. Having visual guides to their contents expands and extends their usefulness immeasurably. That said, after spending the best part of a year looking closely at and thinking about Boyne's history, it's my view that it is even more interesting than simply as a container for the materials Boyne has preserved inside the covers of the 7 volumes. The part of its status as Symington's masterpiece, at least from our perspective to today perhaps, is what we might call the editorial work Boyne engaged in. We actually don't know very much about why Boyne created the history, his motivation for doing so, which is a situation not helped by most of the Boyne family papers being held by the University of Toronto. According to their website, they hold a tantalizing 3 boxes, 34 volumes, and 8 albums of material about Boyne and his wider family, including family correspondence. But that said, there are clues or at least pointers in the small number of Boyne's letters which are held by the Thoresby Society, and even more so in other hints scattered throughout the history itself. Hints that can point us towards concluding that Boyne intended his masterpiece to be, at least in part, a kind of life archive. In particular, in my view, the following additions by Boyne implicitly gesture towards such a conclusion. Firstly, Boyne's inclusion of his personal circle in his selection of material. We've already mentioned the example of John Dixon, one of the artists seen throughout the history. Dixon had been a member of Boyne's antiquarian circle in his Queen Square days, but he was also a regular correspondent with Boyne, as seen in the letters held by the Thoresby Society. But Dixon wasn't the only such case. William Boyne, whose watercolour of Kiddle Hall we saw earlier, was also a member of that same group, and in fact collaborated with Boyne on an antiquarian journal around the same time. Boyne also includes in the history images by members of his own family, including a watercolour by his brother Robert of Arthington Nunnery, and this image on the screen now in the top left-hand corner, a print showing the Harewood coat of arms as inscribed on damask table linen, which was manufactured by Charles Pegler, Boyne's brother-in-law. Secondly, Boyne's updating of Thoresby and Whitaker's volumes down to his own day. We've already touched on the news cutting showing the census statistics for 1851, which were updated by Boyne down to 1892. But here in the bottom left-hand corner of this slide, you can see an example of Boyne updating Thoresby and Whitaker's original contents in the form of an original handwritten essay exploring the histories of the various Leeds newspapers, similar to the annotation work Thomas Wilson did on his copy of the Dechartus Leodiensis, but on a much greater scale. There are many, many such examples of these handwritten editions by Boyne of aspects of Leeds history that were unknown to Thoresby and Whitaker, but clearly considered important to him, to Boyne, in his own perception of the town's past. Third and final, and to me most interesting, is Boyne's literal inclusion of himself into these materials that he's collected and preserved about Leeds and its past. He does this in a couple of different ways. Firstly, inserting published works that he authored, including several articles and the entirety of his book on 17th, 18th, and 19th century coins and tokens, but then also images of himself. Most wonderfully, this image on the right of the slide here, showing Boyne at the Alhambra Palace in Granada, an image which, it must be stressed, has absolutely nothing to do with Thoresby or Whitaker's text in any way whatsoever. Its inclusion really is Boyne wanting to personalise his history, crossing that line into a memoir or life archive. I'm very far from being an expert on extra illustration. I relied heavily in my research for my article on Lucy Peltzer's absolutely wonderful 2017 book, Facing the Text. And I must at this stage acknowledge that I used the copy of this book at the Brotherton Library here in Leeds. We don't have a copy at the Central Library. If you want to view Lucy Peltzer's book, Facing the Text, and I would highly recommend you do so. It's a work of art in itself. Please visit our colleagues at the Brotherton Library. So as I said, I relied heavily in my research on Lucy Peltzer's wonderful book, Facing the Text. And it may be quite possible that personalising your collections in the way Boyne has done is intrinsic to the Grangerising practice. But regardless, I find Boyne's approach fascinating, not least because I think, at least, it points us towards a radical and surprisingly modern way of doing local history. In my experience, having worked as a local history librarian for the last 10 years, lots of people care very, very deeply about local history and engaging with heritage across Leeds. But not many of those people go on to necessarily create local history in the sense of researching and writing about whatever aspect it is that they care about. So often their knowledge or passion is lost, and it's a perennial problem for us in libraries and archives and museums as custodians of the past to try and capture that material, that knowledge, before it does disappear. And part of me does wonder if part of the problem is that it can be truly daunting to even consider contributing to the local history arena when faced with the works of some of your predecessors. How many other fields of study have as their key texts huge, almost literally monolithic slabs of, as Lucy Peltz puts it, pedantic and repetitive lists of office holders, formulaic details of grants and arms, verbose descriptions of local worthies, and so forth. No matter how genuinely important the works of Thoresby and Whitaker have been to the historical lineage in Leeds, they can be perhaps off-puttingly rarefied to the modern enthusiast, impossible to emulate and leading to the erroneous assumption that local history as a practice is only done by particular people in very particular ways. But Boyne, I think, offers a model and a way forward. You don't have to write 800 pages to be a local historian, far from it. One of the lessons of Boyne's history, I think, is that Thoresby has already done that for you. You can take Thoresby's base text and through Thoresby, Whitaker's as well, and use that as your starting point to make your own personalised version of Leeds history, just as Boyne did. And just to go back to our lecture title, that is ultimately, of course, Thoresby's legacy and his historiographical lineage, providing that platform, that basis for others to build on, as Wilson Whitaker all did, as Wilson Whitaker and Boyne, of course, all have done. The celebrations this year, 2026, for Leeds 400 years since the signing of the first Charter of Leeds in 1626, feel like an ideal time to put that into practice. I would love to see new Grangerized editions of the Toccata and Lloydis that take those core texts and, following the inspiration of William Boyne, illustrate their contents with images and historical ephemera that show what Leeds and its regions mean to its people and communities today. That would really be an ideal place to conclude things, but there is something else I absolutely must touch on in terms of that specific word masterpiece that we used earlier, and that's the source of Boyne's wealth, a factor in his biography which drastically complicates his legacy, in my view. I said at the beginning of the lecture that Boyne's father was a successful local businessman, but what I didn't address was the nature of that business. Thomas Boyne was, we know today, in the tobacco importation business, and we know as well that he imported tobacco from the United States of America, specifically Virginia. In fact, Thomas named the family home Virginia Cottage, a newly built building which still stands today on the University of Leeds campus, and whose fascinating later history was in part the subject of a Thoresby Society lecture by Professor Bridget Bennett a few months ago. Thomas conducted his business in the first half of the 19th century, meaning, of course, with a high degree of certainty that the tobacco he imported was grown through the labour of enslaved people of colour. The family wealth and Boyne's magnificent history of Leeds in turn are the result, however indirectly, of that illegitimate trade in human beings. All of which means that when Symington says that the history is a masterpiece of antiquarian workmanship and the most fitting monument the city can boast, we today have to ask, at what cost? Thank you for listening. Please do get in touch using the email address on the screen if you have got any questions about Boyne and his history of Leeds, or if you want to see the index to his history or wish to access it in person yourself with us at Leeds Central Library. Thank you very much.